Good afternoon, colleagues, and a warm welcome to this afternoon's discussion, Measuring, Communicating and Innovating in Uncertain Times. This is the third webinar in a learning series hosted by the Bertha Centre in partnership with our friends at Jet Education Services, Impact Investing South Africa, and the Standard Bank Tutua Community Foundation. My name is Louise Albertine, and I am representing the Bertha Centre's Education Innovation for Impact portfolio. We work to advance social justice through supporting better decision-making for positive impact, as well as building capacity to innovate in the education system. These goals are the drivers for today's discussion. How do we come alongside you, the vital social purpose organizations in education at this time? After a year of immense change and challenge, how do we keep measuring what we are doing? How do we keep innovating when 2020 has left us no choice but to adapt, and rapidly at that? And given this climate, how do we keep communicating well with our stakeholders? We will have a few minutes at the end of the discussion for questions. The panelists will also share any additional resources via the follow-up email that the Bertha Centre will be sending to all attendees next week. Feel free to join the conversation on Twitter. I'll kick us off by introducing various speakers that we have today. Today, I'm honored to host three panelists that I deeply respect for the rigor and heart with which they do their work. But if you don't take my word for it, let me share some context with you. Sarah is the director of the Institute for Monitoring and Evaluation and course convener of the Masters in Program Evaluation at the University of Cape Town. Her areas of expertise include evaluation theory, evaluation design, and monitoring framework development. She's an experienced field evaluator and team leader and has led the evaluations of complex multi-sectorial programs in over 10 African countries over the last 10 years. Over these years, I've seen her commitment to building the capacity of education organizations to monitor and evaluate their impact. Today, Sarah will be sharing her insights on how to keep monitoring and evaluating the impact of your organization when the activities may have changed. To our next speaker. Earlier this year, I was honored to work with Dr. Roxana Rajab in the JET Research Bootcamp to deliver a comparative study on the response of NPOs in education to the COVID-19 pandemic. Roxana is the director of Resonance Consulting Services and former driving project lead of the National Association of Social Change Entities in Education. Many of you joining us today will know them as NASCI. With over 30 years of experience in organizational development. She holds a doctorate in management and innovation focused on systems and design thinking, and is a trusted voice and mentor in the education space. And I know I have benefited greatly from her work and leadership. Roxana will take us through some tips on how to keep innovating as you employ adaptive leadership in response to the changing environment. And finally, our third speaker for today is Mabine Siabe, the co-founder and director of Stratagem Consultants, recognized as one of Mail and Guardian's 200 top young South Africans and Advanced Media's 100 most influential South Africans. He is skilled in nonprofit organizations, crisis communication, social media, and media relations. Mabine has demonstrated his commitment to advocating for a more just education environment in walking a road with some of South Africa's schools towards ending racism and fostering change that is just and fair. We will conclude today's discussion with Mabine's input on how to keep communicating with your stakeholders to retain and even grow relationships. I'm now going to ask the various panelists that you can switch off your videos. And Sarah, we're going to get started with you. I will give you a 1 minute left heads up.
Thank you, Louise, for that introduction. And thank you for the opportunity to be presenting on this really, really important topic and really to have the opportunity to present in this space and allow for some reflection and learning. So Louise has already introduced me. Thank you. I don't need to go over who I am. But just in terms of the content that I thought I would cover today, I mean, it's a huge topic, and we're all doing so much in order to adapt in this crazy year. So I thought what could be really useful is if I just give you some questions to help frame the no doubt multiple thoughts and activities and undertakings that you have undoubtedly been implementing already as organizations, to think about some guiding thoughts in modifying your monitoring, evaluation, and learning plans in this time. And then I also thought I would speak a little bit about ways that we can perhaps adapt our data collection strategies and approaches. So some ideas about alternate approaches and solutions in this space. So firstly, let's talk a little bit about, some guiding principles around modifying our monitoring and evaluation learning plans. And the first thing I just wanted to mention is that anything we do, of course, should just encompass the general principles of safety first. So everything that we implement and everything that we do, it should be designed to not put our data collectors at risk or our participants at risk. And then, of course, the fundamental issue of just to keep communicating. And I know we will have some more sessions on this matter. Now, many of you have already adapted your technical and operational plans, evaluation resources, budgets, in order to adapt our monitoring evaluation activities. And then, of course, to keep that dialogue going with the funder. This is, almost a given. I'm sure you're doing that already, but this really provides an opportunity to really rethink your monitoring, evaluation, and learning strategy and provide an opening for negotiation and improvements that perhaps might have been a little bit more closed in less crazy times. So the first thing I want to just raise when we have these kind of guiding thoughts about MEL revisions is, of course, to constantly keep rethinking your indicators. So we might do this in a number of ways. We might think about, how have our targets and definitions needed to be updated or modified? For example, many of us have moved from in-person training to virtual training or virtual instructions. So we need to think about how virtual training can now be counted towards our indicator calculations, and how we might need to perhaps update our MEL frameworks, our indicator definitions, so that we capture these new activities. At the same time, we could leverage these new opportunities in order to think of new data collection opportunities. For example, if you're doing these virtual trainings, how can you embed perhaps online polls or online assessments in these trainings to capture data while people are online and in that forum? And you might also think about, are we counting the registrations? Have we adapted our data collection templates and indicators so that we capture this new mode of delivery? Another thing is to think about, of course, the timing of our monitoring and evaluation activities. So, some of us might have planned to do, scholar learning assessment or regular routine assessments, which of course we might think about how we might need to delay. And I'll speak a little bit about that later as well. We might also need to rethink about our sample design. Are we still capturing reliable information? Are our indicators spotty, or our data collection, is it incomplete? Are there alternate data providers we need to think about? Are there proxy indicators or proxy data providers we can use? Do we need to supplement our sample? And then we might, of course, need to also think about how this pulls through in data quality and that communication with the funder that is so important around these changes in measurements and targets. We also need to think about making way for new indicators. Okay, so we're doing all these new activities. What really takes stock of what are the new activities we're implementing to reach our beneficiaries? How have we adapted our programs to remain relevant? For example, we might have been asked to aid in COVID prevention or COVID compliance measures in various schools or education facilities. Make sure that these additional, for example, the changes in the learning environment have meant that internet access and device access is so critical to now accessing learning and achieving learning outcomes. So these are contextual indicators that might not have been part of our original MEL plan, which we might need to think about expanding our MEL framework in order to capture, indicators around device access and internet connectivity. We also need to think about other contextual indicators like the impacts of COVID on the economic environment. There've been lots of warnings about how this is going to have knock-on effects on our learning environment. And so, how can we really adapt our indicators so that we can maybe capture stuff around economic well-being, economic employment opportunities of parents, what's happening in the geographic location or the subpopulation that we're working in, which might then give us a rationale for adapting our programs or even applying for more fundings, because we're able to see an increased need that our programs need to respond to. So all this talk about new indicators and expanding our data collection platforms, I just thought it might also be a good point to take stock and just remember what I like to refer to as the rule of hand. So it's quite interesting, when NGOs and educational NGOs ask me to come in and advise them on monitoring and evaluation and learning activities, I think I often get a bit of an eye roll from the program managers, and they think, oh my word, she's going to tell us we need to collect a whole lot more data and we're not doing enough and we don't have enough indicators and it's going to add to our workload. And I think that people are often quite pleasantly surprised to see that what I usually say is people are collecting too much data and they need to actually tone down and refine their indicators. And often program managers don't believe me and they fight with me and they say, no, we need these indicators, we need these indicators. So while there is a need to expand and rethink for more contextual or adapting our indicators, the idea is, less is more. And why is this? Ruxana will be speaking a little bit about adaptive management, but I always enjoy the words of C.S. Holling, who actually wrote the book on adaptive management and who actually coined the phrase in the 1970s. And, he spoke about how, complex systems like the ones we're working in right now are really characterized by interactions of very large numbers of variables. But the important thing is to remember that you do not have to capture this complexity. In fact, the most important changes can often be understood by analyzing just a few. And they even said typically no more than 5 key variables, which is why you will always see pictures of Holling holding up his hand and reminding people that in these complex systems for adaptive management, do not attempt to respond to adaptively more than 5 indicators. You might be required to report on it more than 5 indicators for compliance or donor reporting. But if you think about what we can really use our monitoring and evaluation for in order to enhance learning, it's often true that, we don't necessarily need these complex models. And, actually managers don't have the capacity to respond to and actually, actively work with more than these indicators. And I found that this is a general good rule to carry through into monitoring and evaluation, especially in times of complexity. So just bear in mind this rule of hand and think about always what can we actually respond to in terms of adaptive management and what do we need to collect for compliance and reporting purposes. The next thing you really need to think about is actually just relooking at your theory of change. I know that theory of change is a bit of a dirty word sometimes. Monitoring and evaluation experts are always bringing it up, but it's an incredibly important tool to really just kind of align this idea of, what we do. How does this activate a series of causal mechanisms that will then actually bring about measurable change? So that's as simple as a theory of change is. And of course, if you can't answer this question as a program manager and you can't speak to this, then really, what are you doing? And what is the point of monitoring and evaluation and learning if it cannot inform this understanding, which is why we use it so fundamentally in the design of monitoring, evaluation, and learning frameworks. So essentially what we do aligns to the activity and outputs, how this activates a series of causal mechanisms are the initial and intermediate outcomes, and how that finally brings about that measurable change is your longer term outcome and your impact as well. So you might want to just think a little bit about, okay, we're implementing all these new activities. Sure. Hopefully we've documented these and we have now indicators to capture them if relevant. But what actually is this new intervention? Does it lead to the same outcomes or different outcomes? Does it actually activate these same mechanisms or these same causal pathways that our whole program design was based upon? So we need to really perhaps potentially review that theory of change and map out changes in outputs and outcomes. And when we do this, we might actually realize that we might need to delay our outcome evaluations, or our outcome indicators might need to be put on hold. It's a waste of resources to actually go out and measure these outcome indicators in terms of learning outcomes or long-term achievement of our scholars. So we might rather try to cover our bases and be sure to measure sort of these initial outcomes or these intermediate outcomes. For example, if you are focusing on skills building programs for senior high school students, and your long-term goal is to kind of achieve or increase employability, you might want to make sure that you are at least capturing, if you're continuing with your training, initial outcomes in terms of knowledge and skills. So at least you can speak to the effectiveness of your training in terms of these initial mechanisms or pathways. Or as I said, you might need to rethink your whole theory of change, because actually what you're doing is something completely different. So another thing we need to bear in mind is that if we find that we don't meet our outcomes, even in the long term, we need to be prepared to answer the question, is this due to a failure in the logic of our program theory? Is this fundamental belief or anticipation about these change mechanisms completely hogwash and actually not based on science or logic or even good reasoning, right? Or is it due to an implementation failure? Was the logic of our change model sound, but we just didn't deliver on our activities and outputs? And if you fear that this might be the case, if you're pretty confident that your change model is still sound and relevant, even in COVID times, then you really need to invest in activity and output monitoring so you can speak to, or even if necessary, defend the possibility of an implementation failure. So another thing we need to do is really embrace new opportunities for learning. I know we all roll our eyes a little bit at this, because this is what people keep telling us during COVID, to keep our energy up and keep our skills up. But I think certainly for me, now that the initial frenzy of the lockdown has sort of passed, I've really been enjoying these opportunities for learning. We might be very, very reactive right now, but we might need to think about what new evaluation opportunities have arisen. What new information is actually relevant right now? For example, we know that the COVID situation is going to have an impact on equity. It's going to exacerbate existing inequalities in our students. So how is this going to affect different subpopulations, especially when we think about differential access to technological resources? So we might want to think about planning right now larger, more ambitious learning assessments for when schools actually reopen, to see whether indeed we have fallen behind on that path. And then we can also motivate for additional funding or adaptively change our program design in light of this new information. So we're ahead of that curve, and we're using this time to design those kind of things. Finally, if there's a delay and we're sitting on our laurels and we can't really collect data, is there any way we can use this to our advantage and think about actually improving on our impact evaluation design or our M&E framework? For example, we might now finally have an opportunity to collect that baseline data that we never had funding or opportunity to do. And we might also have an opportunity to perhaps include a control group or a comparison group in our evaluation activities, or at least plan for that and put in funding proposals for that kind of work. So this brings us finally to what I'd just like to speak on for the last 5 minutes, which is how we can actually learn from this COVID epidemic and use it as an opportunity to improve our data collection strategies and get more efficient and more streamlined. So, essentially there are 3 data collection approaches: in person, remote via text, or remote via voice. And I think, just maybe take a second and pause and think about, what of these 3 approaches are you currently using as an organization? And is it still working for you? And if not, is there a way we could shift or supplement with one of these other approaches in order to get better data and data that we need? For example, perhaps you no longer have staff coming into a physical office and there's not capacity to be able to print out or collect paper-based forms or paper-based data collection forms, never mind even the issue around face-to-face enumeration and data collection in COVID times. So we might need to think about moving away finally from paper-based data collection, which is probably a good move anyway. And I just wanted to just familiarize you, if you're not already aware of it, just point you in the direction of a few really, really useful resources to help you in this move. So if you talk about non-paper-based data collection, we can use offline mobile form technology. So this is like a mobile phone or a tablet-based data collection form where people directly enter data into a mobile phone or tablet. So ODK or Open Data Kit is the most common software that's used for mobile data collection. And a number of platforms that you might be familiar with, such as Kobo Toolbox and Survey CTO, actually use this technology. So they build on this free open source technology. So you can use ODK Open Data Kit yourselves, or what's even more advisable is you use a tool like Kobo Toolbox, which actually uses this technology and also provides additional functionality. So Kobo Toolbox is a free tool that's usually limited to 10,000 uploads or data input entries a month. But during the COVID times, they have actually released removed that restriction. And they've now allowed organizations to have unlimited data access to Kobo Toolbox. So this is actually a humanitarian initiative developed by Harvard University, and it's an open suite of tools for data collection and analysis. So it allows you to really both collect data through ODK Connect, and it also gives you a platform in which to integrate the data into a server or a database, and it also provides basic data representation or dashboard functionality. So it'll actually generate reports and tools so that you can view the data in real time and analyze it. Another thing you might want to think about is, if you are stuck with paper-based data collection, is there a way that you could, drop off surveys at a central point where people collect them, minimize face-to-face contact, but still do that? And if you've got these paper-based surveys, if it's the only thing that you can use because your audience is not data-enabled, just think about some of the technologies that we use to put scanned paper surveys directly into electronic format. So there's Remark Office OMR. It's a software that you can use to take that paper-based survey and actually digitalize it automatically. And we can also use, even if we have paper-based surveys, we can then get our staff or our enumerators to capture the data directly into Kobo Toolbox or the mobile phone-based data collection tools. So another thing to think about, of course, are online surveys. Obviously, this will be limited to people who have internet connectivity and device access. But if that is an option,
a minute heads up, Sarah.
Thank you, Louise. And Microsoft Forms and SurveyMonkey is also known very well. And there's also an Intecto survey, which is automatically turns existing ODK forms into web form, and that's free on Kobo Toolbox. There are also some platforms for SMS-based surveys. I'll put you in the direction of Frontline SMS, which also has a platform specifically for educational interventions to do SMS-based data collection if your target audience is not data enabled. And then, of course, there's also the shift to phone call-based data collection and interactive voice collection, which I'm sure many of you are already doing. So that's all I wanted to do. I really just wanted to get you to think about pausing, reflecting, and revising your MEL frameworks, seizing opportunities, and really keeping those opportunities to keep learning in this space. Thank you so much for the time, Louise.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. Rukhsana, over to you.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Sarah. That was a very insightful presentation. Is it all right? Can everybody see it? Louise?
Perfect.
Thank you. So good afternoon, colleagues. It's just wonderful to be here this afternoon to share a little bit of my insights with regard to adaptive leadership, especially in the uncertain times that we are facing. So as Louise said in the introduction, we had done some research with a large number of NGOs, and we found initially that as soon as the lockdown happened, 27% of the NGOs in education had actually shut their doors. We haven't done any research follow-up to see whether they have come back on mainstream, but we know at this point in time that there are a number of education NGOs and largely social change agents that are struggling in these times. So I'm going to share some of that with you, which will come through with my presentation, but I'll also perhaps share with you some of my, deeper insights through my own experiences over the years on how to be adept in these times, show up with grit and resilience, and always bear in mind that whilst we do what we do, we need to remain human and empathetic. So I've split my presentation into three key areas that I want to share with you: embracing innovation, being empathetic, and developing resilience. We've been in this lockdown for more than 8 months now. And if you are here and you're still the head of your organization, or you're a senior manager, executive manager in a leadership position, then congratulations, because you've survived the worst of times. But it's not yet over. And sad to remind you that we are seeing a second wave in Europe. The UK is now going on a second surge and shutting down doors of various organizations. America is continuously on the rise through to their voting processes and their leader that says it's fine not to wear a mask. And generally people are feeling, I wish I could have a crystal ball to look into the future. And it's really about not knowing how to plan, not knowing what's going to come, not knowing how to actually survive. And there's just too many variables at play. I think most people have on their mind the financial risk, the shrinking of funds, donors that are being more selective. But there is also this will for making sure our humanity reaches out to continue with the work that social change agents do. And whilst we see many shops having to let signs, people have changed and reflected on their purpose in life, we also see large organizations like the South African Qualifications Authority, I just read a notice yesterday, is going to be retrenching staff. And that's quite worrying. So it's precisely in this uncertain time that really, I think, this is just my view, and I really believe that the most important thing right now is the people. Your people in your organization looking inward at how their health is at risk, their relationships, working remotely, how are they managing the organization. And then your stakeholders, your board, your governance structures, they need to be taken into consideration. You need to shape and reshape and reframe how you have been doing things. And it's not normal strategies that you would apply. And finally, your beneficiaries, the most important of your organization structure, the purpose for which you were set up, your learners. And you need to reach out to these. So why should we be innovative, resilient, and empathetic, with people being the most important factor? Let me emphasize several reasons. We have no choice but to survive, to continue with our programs and the commitments that we have made so that we do not become redundant. Your services are required more now than ever before. By virtue of our position of leadership, we are responsible for the livelihoods of the very people that we have employed. And some of us have already received funding and therefore become accountable and need to be responsible, with the program that you are delivering. And last but not least, with our beneficiaries, as social entrepreneurs in the first instance, we have to make that difference. We have to be positive, and we have to make sure that we drive our own purpose as social change entities. And that is why we need to keep people in the center of our focus. It is when times that are tough that leadership shines. It is not your position of authority, but the relationships that you will foster during this time that you will be remembered by. So I really plead to make sure that all of you are empathetic to the cause, realize the environment that we're working in, and foster those relationships during this time. According to the Harvard Business Review, also I think it was June 2020, described 5 characteristics: lead courageously, manage risk, demonstrate curiosity, learn continuously, seize opportunity, and maintain a strategic business perspective. But can we do all of this when we are in a crisis? Can we cope with these things when things are going tough? And my view is we have to stop and pause. We have to reframe how we think. We have to take a longer term view. Besides the current crisis, we still need to plan for what's still to come. And that process cannot stop. So while you're looking at the characteristics that requires you to continue every day, you have to take that strategic decision to actually take your people with you. I have been involved in a project recently. I'm actually still involved in a large project in the post-school education and training sector. And we've gone through a scenario planning process, a wonderful tool to bring everyone into the same room. And it can be an online with breakaway sessions, and I'm sure you found ways of dealing with that already, where you look at the possibilities of the future. And so people understand that change is here, change is happening, but they also understand why the change is necessary and what change you are going to actually institute. So it was a very interesting exercise, and I certainly learned a lot about how scenario planning and thinking about what could be brings real benefits to actually engaging, brainstorming, building your strategies around all these stakeholders in the same workshop. You could have beneficiaries there, you could have your board members there, your staff members, and all brainstorm and share in the ideas. And that is why I would call that co-creating the future. And we need to make sure that we collaborate as we co-create that future. We all must acknowledge that we have our own biases and we work in silos, especially now we work remotely. And there is very little chance of standing at the water cooler or sharing a cup of coffee where you normally would share your ideas. And this is why it needs to be quite purposeful in coming together to create that system change, in approaching how your organization is going to go forward and charting that path that you want to build. It is the vulnerable societies that need to actually build trust, and we need to make sure that they are represented. We need to bring them into the room with us. We need to understand their plight. We need to share their ideas and what will be available as resources as we go forward. Our reality is that the death toll is soaring globally, and the global economy is on the brink of depression. And there are also, you've seen many pockets of racial and other social tensions arising. This all comes from a situation of anxiety, of not knowing what the future holds, of people losing their jobs, hunger and unemployment. And here we are with our organizations, positioning ourselves to deal with this environment in which we are working. And therefore, empathy is very, very important. It is that working together, listening to different perspectives and understanding those perspectives. The interconnectedness of these challenges are all related. The health issues, the food insecurity, the access to technology, working remotely, having a little child in a meeting, standing at your shoulders, waving at your your group of people as you present your seriousness of your work. And we all have to deal with those kinds of issues. So we need to share that big picture and take our people with us. It is that resilience that's going to make you see the opportunities that are available and bring strong teams. And this is where the innovation actually starts. It's creating that change together, making sure that you have the strategies in place. So as an individual and as a leader, you are central to this process. And in developing your supportive networks around you, making sure that you take your teams with you, you need to place yourself in that ecosystem to strategize for funding, to strategize around technological transformation. A few years ago, there were big debates about whether we actually should have technology drive us or whether we should drive technology, and the debate is no longer existing. We actually all exist on technology, and we need to make sure that we embrace technology. We actually don't have a choice in the matter. We also need to have a strong people development plan. So social innovation is not necessarily about a new product or a new invention. Social innovation is how you actually rethink your strategies, how you would position and shape yourself amidst the people development and the planning that's required for that. And with that would come constant communicating. You would need to make sure that your website clearly positions you to make sure that your stakeholders know that you are still existing, first of all, that you are updating your strategies, that you are reaching out to your beneficiaries, that you are changing your methodologies of teaching and learning, that you have got a platform perhaps, and if not, you are working towards that. Keep them updated constantly through various forms of communication, and I'm sure our next speaker will also talk more about communication and give us more insights into how best we should be communicating in these times. But these are the strategies. A communication strategy is absolutely essential at this time. So many of you might have already taken this action, but it needs to be quite broad initially. Funnel it, get the ideas, innovate, be creative, work with your teams. There's no time for complacency. You need to have the benefit of the reserves planned well before the pandemic actually takes over our lives. And while we're doing all of this, we need to make sure that we build trust. It is actually in the communication, the transparency, the sharing of information that you will build trust. You can't ask someone to trust you. You need to make sure that you earn that trust. And by being the leader of your organization, it's okay to say, I don't know. I don't know how I'm going to address this problem or that problem. And you would find that there are a host of ideas that will come through. So my last words is creating that change together. We need to make sure that we manage our people, we manage our strategies, we manage our organizations. It might not be rocket science to you, but just a reminder that that is what social innovation is about, rethinking and reframing how we do things. Thank you.
Roxana, thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. Mabina, over to you.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you to my co-panelists. It's nothing better being part of a panel like this where there's a level of synergy between what the different speakers have said, but there is a bit of pressure on me seemingly have to give all the answers when it comes to communication. But this isn't going to be an exhaustive discussion or input around education. It's going to be the fundamentals of how you should be driving your communication strategy during this time of crisis. Hence, I've stated that communication during a global crisis is of your own making, but it's a crisis in which you're involved in. It's a crisis that you're part of, and it's a crisis that you have no choice but to get through. And the stats given by the previous speaker is shocking about the number of NGOs that have shut down, because to use lockdown terms, NGOs are an essential service. They are probably the most direct interaction with communities and the most involved organizations involved in change, other than those involved in politics, or at least in an ideal world. So a lot of the principles which I'll put forward here are for general communication, but there's going to be a laser focus on crisis communication. The reality is that with communication, like any part of your organization, they need to adapt to the world around you. And in a crisis, your communication is a responsibility because you've got a responsibility to your stakeholders, you've got a responsibility to community, and you've got a responsibility to your beneficiaries. In The Economist, The Politics of the Pandemic, they stated when leaders downplay the threat in a misguided attempt to avoid panic, they end up sowing confusion and costing lives. Nothing stokes rumour and fear more than the suspicion that politicians are hiding the truth. When they downplay the threat in a misguided attempt to avoid panic, they end up sowing confusion and costing lives. Yet leaders have struggled to come to terms with the pandemic and how to talk about it. And I think anywhere where it mentions politician or leaders, you can substitute that with NGO, and it's exactly the same terrain in which you as social good, social purpose organizations are operating in. And again, this point is emphasized by Greta Thunberg, the climate change activist, who said there's no sense of urgency whatsoever in our leaders. Our leaders are not behaving as if they were an emergency. In an emergency, you change your behavior. It's important to understand what communication is, especially as it becomes a centerpiece in many organizations day to day. It's a dissemination of information to a target audience using one or more mediums, where you can use the press, that would be radio, TV, newspapers, online, that would be more of your public relations. There are digital media platforms, being your social media, your website, and your podcast. It was stated that it's important that your website is up to date to show that you are working and you're operational, and to show what is it that you're doing, what is it that you've changed in your operating model during these testing times. Podcasts don't often feature in presentations around this, but more and more they're becoming the staple of people who consume media, especially young people, as people no longer want to, for instance, consume the entire 4 hours of the radio show. They'd like to take bits from, say, a speaker or so. And it's also important for organizations that, like yourselves, which are forward-facing, to perhaps look into engaging in matters like this. It's relatively inexpensive. You can use technology that's as easy as your cell phone to be able to record 15-minute discussions about what your organizations are doing, to record messages for the various categories of stakeholders, beneficiaries, and such. Email, it's a tried and tested use of communication for your stakeholder community engagement. And often people forget internal communication, which is communicating with staff. Often those in management, C-suite, like to keep information to themselves. But at a time like this, you need to bring your entire organization along with you and be able to communicate with them constantly and consistently. And then there's your marketing material, which would be paid advertising, whether it's in the press or using digital media, and your awareness campaigns, conferences, and webinars. These are the vital principles of communication. You speak to any communicator, they'll give you a different list, but nonetheless, there'll be consistencies, as we'll show here. Now, your communication needs to be coordinated. There it was spoken about your communication strategy and your communications plan. It needs to be clear and targeted. The message and its purpose must be without contradiction or nuance. And in targeting, you need to ensure who is it that you're speaking to. When you're speaking to your community around you, it must be understood that many of the organizations are operating as guests in the communities that you are. So what language is being spoken in those communities? It's almost a fruitless exercise to release communication completely in English when the majority of your stakeholders in the community are Afrikaans. So what are you doing to ensure that the message is accessible to everyone? There must be transparency. especially at this point in time, good and bad. Part of your transparency as organizations may be the fact that you are struggling financially. Put that front and center when you're speaking to your stakeholders, because but connect that with the message of the fact that without their funding, you cannot continue doing the good work that you do in the communities. It needs to be regular. What was said today may not reply tomorrow, but you also need to decide what your regular is. For some organizations, communication needs to happen on a daily basis, weekly basis, monthly basis, and so on. And we must also use holidays, perhaps linked to what your organizations do to communicate, to fundraise through a call to action. For instance, the Christmas New Year period is always an important time to communicate. It's both a reflection of the year that has passed, but also forward-looking to ensure that your stakeholders know that there's still work to be done when we take down the Christmas lights or wherever it might be. And it needs to be credible. What is said is as important as who said it, when it's said, and such. People must be able to believe. It must be genuine. It must be sincere in its approach. And it was very nice to see the guest list and to see that there are C-suite executives as well as people involved in fundraising, PR, and communication on this webinar, because there's often discussion about how communication is used in the organization, and is it part of the organization's complete strategic plan? And does organization in fact feature it all in your planning? We come to the philosophical question of, if a tree falls and no one is around to hear it, does it in fact make a sound? If you're engaged in the work that you're doing and you're not communicating about it, are you doing it? Stakeholders, funders are no longer interested in just getting a report at the end of the year. They want to be able to see on a constant basis that the investment that they're putting into the organizations is doing what needs to be done. That's why it's important that your communication is also visual, whether it's video, whether it's film and such. And also, as I said, more often than not, your communication is an afterthought or a nice to have. That's why even your strategic planning, that's going to happen. And your strategic planning no longer happens, for instance, on an annual basis or biannual basis. It's happening on an almost monthly basis, given the circumstances that we're in. So are your communicators in the room? Hence I say that your communication planning and coordination should be driven at the highest level of the organization, because your communicators are the ones who are going to give life to the vision of the organization. Your communicators are the ones who have to convey perhaps bad news in not such a bad way, or in a more palatable kind of way, but without hiding the truth. So these are the conversations that I'd like the C-suite executives and your PR people to have. Essentially, where's communication localized in the organization, and how much input do communicators have within the organization, and is communication part of the planning as you go forward? Reality is that the world is communicating, are you? And I finish off with this quote by Nikki Gupta, with no relation to the ones that we know here in South Africa. With effective communication emerging as the bedrock of brand management strategies, public relations has evolved into a necessary component for brands and organizations. Once considered a non-necessary investment, PR has grown to become a vital component of brand communication today. COVID-19 and its aftermath have lent a fresh push to the PR industry and brought about a new round of growth as well as evolution. And even when you speak with, whilst this quote almost seems like it's a necessity with organization, there are different ways in which you can have communication within organization. You need to decide whether do you need someone who's going to be in the office every day, someone who's part of your organization, someone who's part of your planning, and also can you justify putting someone whose communication on your payroll, and will that investment pay off? Or do you need someone who's going to be external, someone who's going to be able to assist you with your communication, which is often a cheaper option? but the cheap option method does not necessarily translate into the best option for your organization. So once again, I come back to the strategic planning and the planning for your organization as you head into a new year and as you do your regular planning, is where does communication fit in, and how does it work in communicating our vision, and how does it work in communicating what is it that we want to achieve in building better communities. Thank you very much, Louise.
Great, thank you to you, Mabine. Thank you for that. Okay, we're going to go to some questions. You still have an opportunity to post your questions. Sarah, I'm going to kick off with you first. I'm just going to see if I can quickly jot down the question here so everyone can see in the comments. Right, Sarah, there was a question of, do I need an expert to help me redesign my theory of change? If I realize, as you said earlier, unfortunately, worst case scenario, I realize there was a flaw in the logic of our model.
Yeah, thanks, Louise. That's a really great question. So people who sort of work with program theory, recognize broadly three categories that we can use to both build program theory and check the plausibility. So the first is like common sense. Is it actually plausible when you sit down at the table that this is going to lead to that outcome? And it's actually amazing how often simply sitting down as a group in a workshop setting can really, really revisit some of those key assumptions. And often also with NGOs, we have a founder syndrome where there is quite a CEO or somebody who comes with a vision of what's going to work, and actually it might not be plausible. So sometimes having a group come round and an external evaluator come round and sort of check the plausibility is great. You can also draw on your expert knowledge or the experience of your team. But if you feel that's lacking, the last thing we would suggest is to go to the social science literature and look at what evaluations have said. So map out that theory of change, map out the mechanisms, and then systematically check for evidence that those mechanisms work. And that is actually a type of evaluation called a theory evaluation. And you can actually get an evaluator to do that for you if you don't have access to the literature.
Sarah, I'm just going to follow up there with, because I know you won't advertise yourself, but I know that you've recently made a short course available online for building this capacity within organizations. Will you just tell us a little bit about that and perhaps drop the link in the chat function?
Sure, I'll drop the link in the chat, and it's an online UCT short course that we've done in collaboration with Get Smarter, and it's an 8-week short course, and it takes you through adaptive program management and monitoring and evaluation. So it puts a lot of emphasis also on theory of change building, but it's really focuses a lot on adaptive management and how to combine management and adaptive management with monitoring and evaluation and learning. So yeah, that's another way to upskill yourself. And also, I won't promote myself, but if anyone would like a theory evaluation or somebody to do the more academic side with their program theory, I can also circulate the request to our alumni network, and we can get some students who might do it, or ex-students who might do it quite cheaply.
It's a great offer. Thank you, Sarah. And I can vouch for that, having that partnership with you before and seeing the value of having students come on board. Roxana, the next question is to you. I'm just going to pop it here in the chat. It was, how do you motivate a team to keep up with trends so that as an organization we stay relevant and not lose beneficiary interest?
Ooh, okay. So I largely spoke a lot about how we need to make sure that we take people along with us on this journey of finding new ways and innovative ways and strategies. And I sort of ended up by saying that we need to make sure that we communicate all the time, make sure our stakeholders understand what we're doing, make sure that our staff, our employees are part of the process. And I think one of the most difficult things is about reaching out to our learners and our beneficiaries. We have these wonderful programs, but working remotely has not been that easy for many of the beneficiaries. So already I know of a number of people, friends of mine, who have got children from the same home with the same access to technology and networks. And one is thriving, loves it being working online, is really, thriving in this environment. In the same family, the other child with the same kind of methodology and access to technology just hates school doesn't want to actually complete assignments, does not want to. So it's actually the methodology that would change, the learning, teaching and learning theories and the interface that we would need to adapt. So I think, my advice would be to actually get to know what kind of a learner it is, or the beneficiary on the program, first of all. So the teacher or lecturer, if it's higher education, largely we leave them to their own self-discipline when they move into the higher education. But this is when they also need that support. So if we understand what environment that learner actually thrives in, you need to shape that. So I would suggest that those that are managing with online tools, you continue with that. But there are a lot of different examples that we could use. Storytelling, using real life examples of being innovative in the way we put homework and assignments, where they actually have to go and report on some research that they have done, so that we make it interesting. These are social beings. They want that interaction. And that is why they are actually now missing that link where they would normally come to the classroom, engage with the teacher or engage with their friends and learn socially. I think at this point in time, we also have to rely on homeschooling quite a lot. I'm sure many parents have set aside routinely time in their day to monitor and coach their children. And I think the pandemic's actually brought us closer as families. And this is the time when that interaction between child and parent becomes so important. That reliance on real life learning and understanding the realities of where we are. It's all learning. It's all, being exposed to new skills. So I would say adapt how you teach and learn, adapt how the child responds, and reach out to those beneficiaries and understand what their requirements are.
Great, thanks, Rukhsana. Mabine, I'm going to throw you under the bus a little by asking you to respond to a great comment that one of the attendees made. I've just reposted it here from Nadine. As regards communication, the challenge with communicating externally is that it costs money. NPOs are already cash-strapped. Rukhsana gave us an idea of just how the organizations are struggling. So advocacy and marketing is often not a priority in financial planning. So I'm going to ask you to respond to that, and perhaps one step further, which is, how do we advocate that is actually a vital part of our budget, that is a credible line item and not a luxury that can be given up during times of crisis?
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I mean, it's a brilliant comment, and it's a comment that comes up often when speaking to organizations like this. And it can be expensive if you are looking for bells and whistles kind of communication. But it's understanding what is it that you're trying to convey and what is it that you're trying to communicate. So platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram and such, and even LinkedIn, have become more and more important in the way organizations communicate with organizations. There's a growing number of people who have smartphones, growing number of people who are on social media networks. So that's your first point of call when communicating. Doesn't need to be fancy. It can have a picture attached to it. And even when you want to communicate via email, for example, Google is a great platform and relatively easy to use for designing things like letters. And one of Bertha Center's personnel posted a link around Google Kits. And even Instagram has done very well, as Facebook, to help organizations, especially small enterprises, as well as NPOs and NGOs, so they can continue doing the work that they need to do. And how do you justify it to funders that communication is an important line item? It comes back to the slide that if no one is talking about what you're doing, then you're not doing the work that needs to be done. It's the basics of marketing and communication, that you need to you need to explain to your funders rather that the work that we do is not just confined to the communities in which you work in. It has far reaching consequences to the work that you do. It also, communication connects you with other organizations. This, what we're doing today, is a communications function. And yes, it costs money and bandwidth and such to put this together. But if you show that the interconnectedness that communication provides and the opportunities that communication provides, I think it will be an easy sell. And as I stated previously, that you also need to, as an organization, decide whether it's communication that you want to do internally, which often costs a little bit more money because then that's putting someone else on the payroll, or whether it's something that you want to do externally, which has its own complications. But if you have the right people working together, then it would look like you're running a R1 million campaign when in fact you're working on a shoestring budget. And I completely understand the constraints that NGOs have. I started an NGO almost a decade ago with a few friends with no money, anything. But we used social media to get our message out there. And through social media, other people started to take notice of what we're doing, not just funders, but other organizations that were involved in similar work that we were doing. And so just as a final point, and a criticism that I have with a lot of social purpose organizations, is that a lot of you are doing the same work and duplicating work in same communities and speaking to the same people. When there's opportunity for collaboration, and you find that in collaboration, your overheads come down, other costs come down. Yes, we want to be front and center and we want our names up in front, but at the end of the day, the most important people here are your beneficiaries. And if we don't get right for the beneficiaries, that's where organizations fail. Thank you.
Thanks, Mabine. And there, just a shout out again to the organization that I mentioned earlier when introducing Roxana, and that being NASCI. I will just post the link to them as well, the National Association of Social Change Entities in Education. That's actually really sought to formalize that process of coming together for greater positive impact. I'm going to give all the panelists just an opportunity to share their closing thoughts. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Louise. No, it's just wonderful to see some of the chats and comments, and that people are already starting to think about how they can rethink the plausibility of their program and really innovate and maybe expand their data collection approaches and improve on them. So yeah, so please, we will share the PowerPoints and have a look at some of those platforms that I recommended and think about how you can keep trying to make the most of this crazy time.
So I think Mabine has just reminded us all of a very, very important point, and that of collaboration. But I'm just, getting to a point where when we mention collaboration, I just go, it's just another talk again. We know we need to collaborate with each other. We need to make sure that government collaborates with NGOs, and it's time for action. We cannot be sitting by the wayside and talking collaboration. So as much as I would also, promote collaboration, I'm actually for collaboration. We need to actually have strategies in which we can implement collaboration. And I think that when we get together to collaborate, it's the value of not only looking at how we can gain personally. It's about socioeconomic gain, it's cultural gain, it's a political gain, it's about developing people for your country. Thanks, Louise.
Thanks, Roxana. Mabine?
These are tough times for everyone, and I want to congratulate all of you for the work that you're doing. It is an essential service. And a lot of the numbers that have been reflected on in terms of poverty, unemployment, and inequality, I think would have been significantly high had it not been for the work that a lot of your organizations are doing and continue to do. So just from my side, I wish you nothing more than the best. And on a slightly somber note, condolences to anyone who has lost loved ones or colleagues during this time. And keep on soldiering on, because I think there's a light at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you, Mabine. Just to once again express my thank you to Sarah, Roxana, and Mabine for generously sharing your expertise and practical guidelines. Thank you, attendees, to you for joining us today. We appreciate your time and the work that you're doing, and we look forward to continued engagement with you. You can sign up for the Bertha Center Education Innovation newsletter from the email that we'll be sending to you next week. Thank you very much to all of you. I've just posted the names again of the various panelists if you'd like to reach out to them on LinkedIn or via Twitter. And as mentioned, we will include all the presentations in the email next week. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.